This is why you should never live next to crazy people. In 2015, a girl who was totally fed up with her noisy neighbors finally worked up the courage to go over there and tell them to be quiet. She knocks on the door and out walks this insane looking old woman who just starts hissing at her. And she doesn't stop hissing at her until the girl finally just leaves. She considers calling the police, but ultimately just goes back to her room and goes to bed. But she wakes up a couple hours later when she hears that same hissing sound. Her first thought is there's no way this can be my neighbor because she had her door locked. But then she notices there's a big lump right next to her in her bed and she reaches over to check who it is. Her crazy neighbor leaps out of bed and runs into the closet.
I am safe.
I love how confident this guy was. In 1731, the King of Sweden was given an incredible gift. His very own lion, who he loved and totally spoiled. Unfortunately, it died young. After a couple of sad years, the king finally decides that he wants to memorialize the lion, so he sends its pelt and the bones to a world-renowned taxidermist. Now, unfortunately, the taxidermist that he sent it to had never actually seen a lion before, and it's 1731, so he can't just Google it. But he doesn't want to let the king down or jeopardize his reputation, so he's like, yeah, send me its bones and pelt. I'll whip you up a lion. This is why you should always trust your gut. In the 1970s, a young couple decided to go for a late night hike in the woods. A couple minutes into their walk, and the man remembers thinking something's not right. He tells his girlfriend, but they just decide to ignore it and keep going, until he steps on something that felt really soft, like it was alive. Before he has a chance to see what he stepped on, they hear all this rustling in the bushes next to them and they bolt. Years later, that couple turns on the TV and a death row inmate who's about to be executed is being interviewed. And they ask him, was there ever a time that you were almost caught red-handed? He responded, yes, one time. I was in the woods and a couple walked through and the man actually stepped on the body of a girl I had just killed. I was hiding in the bushes just a few feet away. They didn't see me. That couple had run into one of the worst serial killers of all time, Ted Bundy. This is why you shouldn't go for walks in Sweden. In 2008, a Swedish woman went out for an evening stroll with her dog, but never came back. Her husband went looking for her and found her dead next to a lake. The police immediately blamed her husband and sent him to jail. After a few months, the woman's forensic analysis report came back, and it was clear the husband was innocent because there was all this hair and saliva on the woman's body that was not his. It turns out there is a very strange phenomenon that occurs in Sweden in the fall when all of the apples have fallen off of their trees. Those apples ferment and then hordes of moose eat those apples, becoming drunk and oftentimes very belligerent, like this drunk moose who got stuck in a tree. The hair and saliva of the killer belong to a drunk Swedish moose. This is why parents should believe their kids. In 2010, a 15-year-old boy started to notice that the door to his attic, which was in his bedroom, was always open. One day, when his mom's giving him a hard time about being lazy, he's like, well, you're one to talk. You always leave my attic door open. She's like, I haven't touched your attic door in months, and nobody else has either. Not easily frightened, the boy decides to leave the attic door open. And so he's laying in bed, and he kind of looks over at the door, and standing in the door frame is a figure staring right at him. He bolts, tells his parents, they don't believe him, and then 6 months later they move anyway. A few years later, the boy discovers his favorite teacher actually moved into his old house. And so he jokingly asks her, you ever see any ghosts walking around your attic? Her face got completely serious, and she's like, you know, as soon as we moved in, the door to the attic kept opening. So we investigated and we found a trap door that led onto the roof. Someone had been crawling in through that entrance and living in the attic for years. This is why you should always be afraid of Australia. In 2014, an 8-year-old and her family went on an extended vacation to, you guessed it, Australia. After a couple of days, she started having this horrible recurring nightmare where an alien would appear in her room and try to grab her with its tentacle. After a week of this, she is terrified to go to sleep, but her parents keep telling her that it's just her overactive imagination. One night, she swears she feels that thing grab her leg and she leaps from the bed screaming. Her family runs into the room and they see her hysterical in the corner, and then they look at the bed and they all gasp. It wasn't an alien. It was a 7-foot-long adult carpet python that had been sneaking in through the ceiling tile and into her bed to stay warm every night. Once you hear why he did this, it will change the way you look at strangers. In 2018, a woman was out for a walk in the blistering cold when she saw a teen girl coming towards her wearing just pajamas and oversized shoes. Turns out it was 13-year-old missing person Jamie Close, and boy did she have a terrifying story to tell. 87 days earlier, a man had broken into her home in the middle of the night, killed her parents, and then taken her prisoner. He brought her 70 miles away to his house where she was kept under a bed and largely forgotten about. She was just there for no apparent reason. When her captor left one night, she managed to escape, and that's when she ran into this woman on the road. Jamie's captor, 21-year-old Jake Patterson, was quickly found, and he immediately confessed. And this is why he did it. On his way to work one day, he stops behind a school bus and he sees a girl get on. He doesn't know anything about her, and he decides, I'm going to kill her family and I'm going to take her. He had no motive, he had no criminal history. This was truly random. Unless you've heard this story, there's no way you could have guessed what was on that ship. In 2012, an old Russian cruise liner was being towed to the Caribbean to be used for scrap when the tow line snapped. They tried to recover it, but it drifted into international waters and everybody just kind of assumed it would sink, so they said, forget about it. It didn't sink, because a year later they got a GPS signal from the unmanned ship showing that it had drifted nearly 2/3 of the way across the Atlantic and was now poised to strike the British coastline. At first, British authorities were not concerned with the damage this ship might cause to their coastline until scientists revealed what was on the ship.
It was being towed to the Caribbean last year when it came loose during a storm. It's now feared to be infested with cannibal rats on board, who, lacking a food source, have turned on each other.
Cannibal rats? That's pretty shocking. But not nearly as shocking as it was for me to see 4 million on my page. Thank you. This is why you should always watch videos to the end. In 2003, a woman came home to her apartment to see that her door was unlocked. She went inside, nothing was missing, so she assumed she must have left it open. When it happened a few more times, but still nothing was missing in her apartment, she went out and got a camera, set it up in her apartment aimed at the front door. The next day, her door was unlocked, so she reviewed the footage. She watches in horror as late in the night, her front door opens and in walks this tall, creepy man who looks around and then walks towards her bedroom off camera. She immediately sprints out of her apartment and calls the police, who show up and tell her to go back in her apartment and just try to stay calm, and that they would put an officer right outside her door so she's safe. As she's sitting on the bed, totally traumatized, she realizes something. She only saw him enter her apartment on that video. She doesn't know if he actually left. As she's sitting there, she feels breathing on her ankles. She runs out, the cop comes in, and he finds the tall, creepy man under the bed holding a knife and a camera. This is why you should never watch my videos before going to bed. In 1986, a young girl opens her closet to find a man wearing a dress and holding an axe. He grabs her and ties her up, and then walks around the house and does the same thing to the rest of her family. While the guy is ransacking their house, one of the kids breaks free, runs next door, and tells his neighbor. The neighbor calls the cops show up, the family's saved, but the guy is nowhere to be found. The family leaves the house and stays with relatives in hopes that they'll catch this guy before they have to go back. But after a few weeks, they haven't caught him, there aren't any leads, and they say, you know what, we'll go back to our house anyways. As the family's pulling back into their driveway, the father looks up at one of the windows and sees for a split second the head of the man with the dress in their bedroom. They call the police, who go in and find pennies glued to the ceiling and weird writing all over the house, but they can't find this crazy guy. Until one of the officers found a secret crawl space in the basement, where psychotic killer Danny LaPlante had been living for 2 months. This is why I'm proud to be an American. In 2014, a team of Navy SEALs were ambushed in broad daylight in a bad town in Afghanistan. They managed to fight off the attack, but by the time the shooting stopped, they were low on supplies and needed to leave. As they coordinated their exit strategy, a drone overhead picked up a group of men hiding in a field near the city's exit. Fearing these might be enemy combatants preparing for another attack, a few of the SEALs stepped aside to go have a better look. As they crept down an alleyway, all hell broke loose when 2 enemy grenades came hurtling over the wall and detonated at their feet. 2 of the SEALs were immediately incapacitated, but luckily their teammates jumped into action, repeatedly exposing themselves to enemy fire in order to save their lives. Without their teammates' bravery that night, those 2 men could have died. And I know because I was one of those 2 men. So on this Memorial Day, I am forever grateful to my teammates who saved my life and to the Gold Star families who carry an unthinkable burden. Thank you. This is why you should always trust your gut. In the early 1970s, a college student decided to hitchhike his way home after class. A car pulls up, a man offers him a ride, and he climbs in. As soon as the car started moving, the student felt totally uneasy, like something was wrong but he couldn't quite place it. Without saying anything, he waited till the next time they slowed down and he flung the door open and ran away. 2 years later, he's flicking through TV channels when he comes across this special interview with a death row inmate. And it's just the audio recording, so he hears the interviewer ask the inmate, "Why did you remove all the door handles inside of your car?" The man just goes, "Well, the first time I tried to kill someone, I picked up a college hitchhiker who got smart at some point and jumped out of my car. So, lesson learned, remove all the door handles." When they showed his picture, the student knew immediately that he was supposed to be the first victim of John Wayne Gacy, aka the Killer Clown, who had killed over 30 men and boys in his clown room and stuffed them into his basement. Yes, this really did happen. In 2015, a man woke up to a strange post-it note sitting on his desk. On it was a to-do list that he didn't recognize in handwriting that didn't look like his. Since he was up late the night before doing some work, he assumed he must have written out the list when he was half asleep and kind of forgot about it, so he just crumples it up and throws it away. 2 weeks later, he wakes up to dozens of these post-it notes all over his wall, and they're all blank except for one that, in the same weird handwriting, says, "Our landlord isn't letting me talk to you." Now feeling totally freaked out that some crazy person is crawling around his apartment at night, he starts looking for signs of a break-in, but there aren't any. Instead of calling the police, he shares his experience on Reddit asking for help, and one user's comment literally saves his life. Turns out the man was writing the notes to himself and then forgetting, because his brain was slowly dying due to a carbon monoxide leak that was only discovered because a user suggested he install a detector. Yes, the picture at the end is real. In 1876, a woman from a very prominent family in Paris goes missing. After years go by and no one has a clue what happened to this woman, friends and family ultimately mourn her death and move on. 25 years later, and this anonymous letter shows up on the Attorney General's desk, claiming that the missing woman's family had a secret. Intrigued by the letter, the police go to the family's home, show it to them, and ask to search the property, to which they say, "Go for it." They search, they don't find anything, but on the way out, they notice something very peculiar. At the end of some stairs was a door that was padlocked shut. When the family refused to open it, the police break it down and make a horrifying discovery. Cowering on a rotten straw mattress in a pitch-black room was the missing woman, now 50 years old and extremely malnourished. Her mother had imprisoned her there after they had fought over her boyfriend, and she had not seen sunlight or another human being in 25 years. This is why you should always watch what you say in public. In the late 1970s, a man began breaking into homes in order to assault the families inside of them. After dozens of attacks and no suspects in custody, the citizens were totally on edge, so the police decide to host this town hall meeting so they can discuss the situation out in public. During the meeting, a local man stands up and says, "I would totally kick that guy's ass if he came anywhere near my wife." Then, in a crazy, ironic turn of events, that angry man and his wife become the next victims. Following their assault, the attacker completely changes his behavior. He goes from kind of petty home invader to full-blown serial killer, targeting only married men and their wives. When decades later, police finally identify Joseph D'Angelo as the killer, as they're going through old photos from the case, they make a startling discovery about his motives. D'Angelo had attended that town hall meeting. This is why you should always be scared of clowns. In 2004, a babysitter had just sat down to watch TV before the parents got back when she noticed something. In the corner of the room was a large clown statue that, no matter how she positioned herself, seemed like it was staring right at her. As she's looking at it, the father calls to check in on the kids. She tells him everything is fine, and right before they're about to hang up, she says, "Why do you have a huge clown statue in your TV room?" There was silence on the phone, and then the father just says, "We don't own a clown statue." She immediately drops the phone, runs upstairs, gets the kids, runs outside, calls the cops. Cops go in and come out with this guy. As the police are taking the clown away, one of the officers comes over to the girl and with a very grim look on his face just says, "We found him underneath one of the kids' beds. He was holding a sharpened screwdriver." Sometimes reality is stranger than fiction. In 2010, a couple renting a cabin in the middle of the woods finds the guest logbook tucked underneath the bed in the bedroom. After reading through it, they decide to call the cops. The final 5 entries are all by the same man. The The first two are just talking about how great it is to be on vacation with his girlfriend. Then it starts to get weird. In the third entry, he describes a stranger lurking in the tree line that doesn't respond to his waves. In the fourth entry, he hears knocking on the windows in the middle of the night, but no one's there. In his fifth and final entry, his handwriting is barely legible, and it just says, "It's in the bathroom, we're going to die." The police show up and find the girlfriend's body in the basement. Next to her body was her purse, and in her purse was her phone. When they open it up, they see that she texted her mother one last time, and it just says, "Mike's starting to act crazy. I think he's off his meds again." This is why you should be careful what you put in the mail. In 2015, a man was asked by his neighbor to collect his mail while he was gone for a few weeks. A few days later, a large package arrives on his neighbor's front porch. The man can barely lift it, but gets over to his garage where he accidentally drops it and hears something break inside. Hoping his neighbor would think the damage occurred en route, he closes his squeaky garage door and forgets about it. But over the next couple of days, whatever was in that package started to smell so bad that he decides to open it up. Inside were two very important finds: his neighbor, who was dead, and a camera that was still recording. The police bring the man in for questioning and show him what was on the camera inside the box. It starts with his neighbor talking to the camera about how excited he is to mail himself home for his YouTube channel. Then, police fast forward to the very end where they see that the neighbor is now sleeping in the box, and then suddenly gets dropped and you hear a crack, and that's his neck breaking. And then you hear a squeaky garage door close. If you make it to the end, I'm sorry. In 2007, a woman was lying awake in her hotel bed when she started hearing a kid run up and down the hall laughing and making tons of noise. She considered going out and telling the kid to be quiet, but eventually just said whatever and fell asleep. The next morning she got up and asked her teenage daughter, who was staying in the room next door, if she had heard the kid, and she said yes, it was so annoying. That night, the woman is back in bed trying to sleep when once again she hears the kid in the hall. Now feeling pretty annoyed herself, she starts walking to the front door to get a better listen when the footsteps stop right in front of her door and she hears the kid playing with the "Do Not Disturb" sign. She leans into the peephole to get a better look, but the kid's gone. So she steps into the hallway and looks down the hall, and there's the kid at the far end, just standing there perfectly still. This is why you might not want to eat deer meat. In late 2019, a man and his grandfather were out hunting when they spotted something way off in the distance that just didn't seem right. A deer was howling and then lowering its antlers and charging forward like a battering ram as if it was fighting with another animal. But when they crept closer, they could tell that the deer was all alone and something was definitely wrong with it. The deer was repeatedly ramming its head into a tree, and then finally one of its antlers breaks off and it kneels down and starts chewing on the antler. As they're watching in horror, the deer in a sudden lurching movement gets up on its hind legs and then walks like a human into the nearby lake, goes under, and does not resurface. Turns out the deer had chronic wasting disease, which is a new, highly contagious neurological disorder that drills holes in the brains of those affected and leads to a distinct lack of fear and awareness and is always fatal. And now, scientists are concerned it might spread to humans in 2020. This is why you always say yes to tandoori chicken. In 2012, a high school tutor and her student stayed up so late one night studying that by the time they were done, the buses had stopped running. Without another way home, the student asked if he could stay the night at her place. Reluctantly, she agreed. When they got back to the apartment, she fell asleep on her bed and he fell asleep on a blanket next to her bed on the ground. A few hours later, she wakes up to the boy standing awkwardly in the middle of the room with a very strange look on his face. She asks him, "What's wrong?" He looks at her and says, "I'm really hungry. Let's go get some tandoori chicken." Confused, she says, "It's 2 a.m. Just get a snack in the cupboard." And he grabs her by the arm and he says, "No, we are getting tandoori chicken right now." And he yanks her from the bed. Feeling totally caught off guard by this whole situation, she goes into the hall with the boy, and as soon as the door shuts behind them, she can tell that he is terrified. He looks at her and just says, "I'm not actually hungry. When I woke up, there was someone under your bed." If someone offers you this, walk away. In 2016, a man was staying at his friend's cabin in the woods when he decided to go for an evening stroll. A little ways down the trail, he hears someone call out from behind his neighbor's house. He looks up and he sees this skinny guy pop out from behind the building who starts waving frantically at him to come over. Worried this guy could be in trouble, the man takes off running to assist. But when he gets close enough, the neighbor just offers him a fistful of Slim Jims and starts talking about how much he hates his wife. Sensing there was something wrong with this guy, he says no thank you to the Slim Jims and walks away. The next day, the man calls his friend who owned the cabin to ask him what the deal was with his weirdo neighbor. There was silence on the phone, and then his friend just says, "I don't have any neighbors." The police are called, and it turns out his neighbor was really some lunatic who had recently killed his wife and had been hiding out in the abandoned cabin next door. This is why you should never stay in sketchy motels. In 2005, a young woman on a solo road trip across the country decided to stop for the night. The first place she sees is the Mountaintop Motel. It looked pretty cheap, but she was tired, so she said good enough. The check-in guy eyed her up and down very uncomfortably and then asked her if she was traveling alone. She ignores the question, pays for her room, and then walks away with the key. When she gets inside her room and sees there are literally cockroaches in her bed, she says nope and decides to sleep in her car in the parking lot. Around 3 a.m., she wakes up to see the check-in guy using his own keys to get into the motel room she was supposed to be in. A few minutes later, he storms out and slams the door and starts walking towards her car. Terrified, she hides under her blanket as the man tries to open her car doors but can't and walks away. She speeds off and calls her friend and asks her to look up the address of Mountaintop Motel so she can give it to police. Her friend's quiet for a second and then just says, "The Mountaintop Motel closed a week ago." This is why you should always change your locks. In 2017, a college girl woke up from a nightmare drenched in sweat and decided to rinse off before going back to sleep. She propped her phone on a shelf, turned on some music, and then hopped in the shower. A few minutes later, she reaches for her phone to change the song, but stops suddenly. Reflected on her phone's screen was a person standing in the middle of her bathroom facing the shower. She somehow kept her composure, turned the water to scalding hot, and then ripped open the curtain and sprayed the intruder in the face. As they howled in pain, she ran past them to her kitchen to get her butcher's knife. In a panic, she can't find her knife, so she just runs out of the apartment and calls the police. The police go in and come out with a crazy-looking woman in handcuffs. One of the officers comes over to the girl and says she used to live here and she had copies of your keys. Then he pauses and looks down and brings up a clear evidence bag that contained her butcher's knife, and he says, "Looks like she wanted her apartment back." This is why you should follow me on YouTube and Instagram. So apparently TikTok might actually get banned in the US. I just thought it was a headline, but it's proving to be something far more serious and it might actually happen. But don't worry, if you've grown to like my scary content, I'm gonna keep on posting it. But I'm gonna do it on my YouTube channel, Mr. Ballin, where I've already posted like 30 videos. Most of it has never even been on TikTok, so it's new stuff. And my Instagram page right here. So it's John Ballin 416. I made this before I became Mr. Ballin. And if you get me to 500k subs on YouTube, I'll open the Mr. Ballin store where you can get your flannels and backwards hats, and you can learn how to grow a crappy mustache and wear socks and Crocs and short shorts. Peak of fashion stuff, you know what I mean? So if that's interesting to you, let's go to 500k. This is why you should always keep your head on a swivel. In 2017, an elderly woman who lived alone thought she saw something moving in her backyard and went to the window to have a look. As she's looking around, a shadowy figure emerges right on the other side of the glass, standing in her backyard. Terrified, she keeps an eye on the figure while calling police, but by the time she hangs up, the figure's gone. When the police arrive, her front door is unlocked, so they go inside and they find her still sitting in front of the window looking for this figure. The police search the backyard, but they don't find anything. When the police go back inside to search the house, they quickly find some large footprints that couldn't have been hers in the room that she was sitting in and all around the first floor. That's when they realized what was going on. She wasn't seeing a shadowy figure in her backyard. She was seeing the reflection of someone in the room with her. This is why you should always sleep with your lights on. In 1991, a man named Christopher Case was found dead in his bathtub, fully clothed in the fetal position. When police interviewed his best friend Sammy, she told them about a very disturbing phone call she got from him the night before he died. On the call, he told her that the previous night he had woken up to what sounded like whispering coming from underneath his bed. When he went to look, he couldn't move. As he laid helplessly, he watched a black figure pull itself out from underneath his bed. Once it was fully upright, it reached down and began choking him until he passed out. The next morning when he came to, he felt his neck and it was swollen and bruised. And then he saw blood on his hands and he saw that there were deep, uniform incisions on each of his fingertips. As he's saying all this to Sammy and telling her how scared he is to go to bed that night, he suddenly stops and he says, "I hear whispering outside my room." Then the phone went dead. This is what they meant when they said, "Don't talk to strangers." In the early 1900s, a 10-year-old boy was playing in the woods when a tall man appeared and asked if he wanted to come back to his cabin for dinner. Totally caught off guard, the boy reluctantly agrees and begins walking. When they get to the cabin, the boy is relieved when he sees Paul, a family friend, sitting on the porch, so the boy happily goes inside. After they eat, the boy says thank you to the strange tall man, says bye to Paul, and then he leaves. He had only walked a few steps when he sees his family, along with Paul, running up the path towards him, frantically asking if he was okay. Confused, the boy says, I'm just fine, and he looks at Paul and he's like, why didn't you tell them I was with you at the cabin? And he points over his shoulder. Paul glances over the boy's shoulder and then narrows his eyes and says, you were kidnapped by a cult 3 days ago. No one's seen you. Terrified, the boy turns around to look at the cabin he just came from, and it's gone. All he sees is a dark forest that stretches for miles. I was going to do something scripted for this, but I'm just going to speak from the heart. I am crushed to find out that TikTok really is getting banned here in a matter of hours in the US. I never would have thought that, 6 months ago when I posted my first scary story that it would have turned into what it has for me and my family. It's opened up more opportunities than I could have ever dreamed of. It's also given me a new purpose in life to create content for people. I love doing that, and TikTok's really been a great outlet for me. Leaving the military was hard, and honestly, content creation's been such a huge part of my new life here. So thank you all so much for giving me that opportunity, and I hope I'll see you on YouTube. I post all the time over there. My channel is Mr. Ballin. I also post on Instagram. My channel is John Ballin, 416 on Instagram. So sad day, but I love all of you. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, and I hope to see you over on YouTube and Instagram. This is why you should always trust your parents. In 1990, a father and his 15-year-old son worked together at a gas station in Florida. One night, the boy was sitting outside on a break when he saw a crazy-looking woman walking towards the store. They were in a high-crime area and it was very late, so the boy turns around to look through the glass at his dad to see what he should do. His dad took one look at the woman and just shook his head, no, do not help her. The woman walks up to the boy and says, hey, my car's broken down, can you give me a ride? Before the boy can answer, his dad bursts outside and says, you need to leave here immediately. Angrily, the woman turns and leaves, cussing them both out the whole way. 1 year later, the boy's in his room at home when his dad calls from the other room and says, you gotta come in here and look at the TV. On the screen was the same woman from the gas station. Better known as Eileen Wuornos, she was a serial killer who used to pick up her male victims at gas stations in Florida. She was later put to death. This is why you never go to the well on your own. In 1983, a young boy was camping with his family on Roan Mountain in North Carolina when his mom asked him to head on down the path and get some water from the well. When the boy didn't return, his mom went to check on him and he was gone. A massive search party was launched to find him, but with temperatures rapidly dropping and finding no trace of him, the family braced for the worst. Then, miraculously, on the 7th day of the search, the boy shows up on the mountaintop in an area they had already searched, healthy and clean. When they asked the boy, where have you been? He said he had been at the well when a tall, faceless man showed up behind him, scooped him up, and brought him to the top of the mountain where he kept him in his cabin all week. After the boy gave a very detailed description of exactly where this cabin was on the mountain, the police were eager to go find it and confront this guy. But the park superintendent just raised his hand and said, guys, it's pointless. I've worked here 40 years. There are no cabins on Roan Mountain. This is why you should never explore abandoned ships. In 2014, the US Navy decided to decommission one of its oldest ships, so it brought it into port to be broken down for scrap. Before workers were allowed to actually start breaking it down, the foreman had to go on board and take pictures of every room. So late one night, the foreman spends about an hour walking through this abandoned ship with a flashlight, taking about 100 pictures. When he was done, he emailed the pictures to his boss, who quickly wrote back, "Who's the guy with the axe?" The foreman had no idea what he was talking about, but he noticed the boss had attached one of the pictures that he had just sent him. When he opened it, he nearly fainted. There, in the bowels of the ship, poking his head around a corner, was a faceless man wielding an axe. The foreman had spent over an hour in this hallway and never heard or saw this guy. The Navy searched the ship and never found this guy. They also reviewed security footage of the only entrance, and he never entered or left the ship. This is why you never judge a book by its cover. On the evening of August 7th, 1985, police received a call about a mentally ill woman attacking her family with a gun. When police arrived at her residence, they didn't hear any shooting or hear any noises coming from inside the house. Police tried yelling for the shooter to come outside, but when she didn't listen, they went in. Inside was a massacre. All 5 family members have been killed, including 2 young children. One of the deceased was Sheila Bamber, the mentally ill woman the police had been called about, and she was holding a rifle that was tucked up against her neck with a gunshot wound underneath her chin. This case gained massive media attention, putting pressure on the police to solve it as quickly as possible, and so they jumped to the conclusion that this had to be a murder-suicide perpetrated by Sheila. But one detective felt like they were missing something and kept investigating. And sure enough, he found something hidden under the stairs at the crime scene that meant Sheila could not be the shooter. To find out what's under the stairs and who the shooter is, check out The Murders at White House Farm on HBO Max. The link to it is in my bio. It's awesome. This is why you should never spend the night on Niku Island. In 1937, while on her flight around the world, Amelia Earhart mysteriously vanished over Howland Island in the Pacific Ocean. Despite an enormous search, she was never found. 3 years after her disappearance, a scientist discovered an incomplete skeleton on this tiny, uninhabited island called Niku Island that wasn't too far from Howland Island. It looked like whoever's bones these were, they had been ripped limb from limb. But when the bones were examined, they determined they were not Amelia Earhart's. But in 2017, a forensic anthropologist re-examined the bones and determined they were almost definitely Amelia's. So scientists went to Niku Island and they found freckle cream, something Amelia was famous for using. So the working theory is she crash-landed on Niku Island and she fell asleep somewhere on the beach. Then, after smelling her blood, hundreds of 3-foot-wide coconut crabs came out of their burrows, swarmed her, and ate her. This is why you should never step foot on the faraway dock. In 1994, an 11-year-old named Mark arrived at summer camp and made his way over to the dining hall where the director was going to talk about the next couple of weeks. The director emphasized that no one was allowed to swim out to the dock located way out in the middle of the lake, although she didn't say why. Mark and the 3 other boys in his cabin were so intrigued by this faraway dock that the next day during lunch, while everyone was eating, they hopped in the lake and started swimming out. When they finally got out to the dock, they were a little bit let down because it looked like any other dock. But they decide to make the best of it, they climb on top and they start playing the game where they all stand on one side until it floods, last one to fall off wins. As the corner sank, they started to hear a scratching sound coming from underneath the dock. Suddenly, hundreds of these big meaty spiders come crawling out through the breaks in the wood and slide down the slanted dock towards the boys, who panic and fall forward, and there's spiders swarming their hair and their face. Turns out the dock was off limits because it was overrun with dock spiders, and the boys flooded their nest. This is why you should never eat a cult's applesauce. During his stay in a psych ward in the 1970s, Marshall Applewhite formed an intense, non-romantic relationship with his nurse, Bonnie Nettles. They quickly realized aliens had preordained their encounter, and now they needed to board their spacecraft once the aliens came back to Earth to give them the signal. The pair formed a cult called Heaven's Gate, and they recruited people by telling them if they missed this one UFO ride, they would be destroyed when the Earth was inevitably recycled. Their cult was considered a joke and not a threat until they did something so horrific it shocked the world. On March 26, 1997, the aliens were going to be passing overhead, hiding behind a comet, and it was now time for the members to hop on board. Over the course of 3 days, members donned matching Nike sneakers, ate poisoned applesauce, tied bags over their head, and then waited to exit the Earth. Right before they died, they conducted exit interviews, and they are truly disturbing. To see these interviews and learn more about the cult of cults, check out Heaven's Gate on HBO Max. Link is in my bio. This is why you should always breathe through your nose. In 2009, a Russian man named Artyom Sidorkin started experiencing intense chest pains to the point where he couldn't even stand up. He tried to ignore it, but when he started coughing up blood, he went to the emergency room. They gave him an x-ray, and it revealed a fist-sized tumor growing in his lung. Afterwards, the doctor told Mr. Sidorkin, unfortunately, it looks like cancer. But before they could start removing large chunks of his lung, the doctor needed to do a biopsy to see if it really was cancer. So a terrified Mr. Sidorkin came in a few days later. They performed the biopsy, and the surgeon, as he was looking at the tissue, noticed something. Tucked in the middle of the tissue was a 5-centimeter long fir tree. Mr. Sidorkin was a botanist, and he was a big mouth breather, and at some point while he was working, he managed to inhale a fir tree seed. When the doctors told him he didn't have cancer, he had a tree, he was shocked, and he said, "I had no sense that a tree was growing in my lungs." But more than shocked, he was just happy to be cancer-free. Bodyguard who stood directly behind him was 22-year-old Melvit Altuntaş. He was a Turkish native who for 2.5 years had served on an elite riot police unit. Andre looked down at the podium at his notes, and then he looked up at the room that was filled with journalists and dignitaries, and he composed himself, he cleared his voice, and he began to speak. Behind him, Mevlut, the bodyguard, opened his jacket slightly and continued staring at the back of Andre's head. And then in one swift motion, he drew a pistol and fired 3 shots into the ambassador's back. And then when the ambassador fell to the ground, Mevlut moved on top of him and fired 4 more shots, killing him. Guests started screaming and running for cover. Meanwhile, Mevlut pointed his finger into the sky and yelled, "Do not forget Aleppo, do not forget Syria." And then he began walking around the exhibits, smashing the pictures on the wall before Turkish security forces showed up. There was a gunfight and Mevlut was killed. But regardless of why it happened, what the world remembers from this event is the award-winning photograph that was taken of Mevlut immediately after he committed the attack. 10 days later, Dylan's body was found in an area nobody was searching. In fact, he was found by accident. He was located outside of town, high up a hill in a dense forest, which in order to get there, he would have had to walk the opposite direction of the gas station. But the case gets even stranger because on the day Dylan went missing, there was a lot of snow on the ground, which meant people would have made tracks. But where Dylan was found, there were no tracks anywhere near him. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. It was as if someone had dropped him out of the sky. Another strange element of this case is Dylan was found without pants and without boots on. This led investigators to believe Dylan must have somehow made his way to that spot on the hillside in that forest without leaving any tracks. And then once he was there, he removed his pants and his boots. Except dozens of police officers and sniffer dogs were never able to find those pants and boots, despite the fact they should, in theory, be in that immediate area where he took them off. As a result, we may never know the truth about what happened to Dylan. After hours of drinking and joking around, they were standing in the backyard on the patio when they noticed a small slug crawling across the ground. And at some point, one of the boys yelled out, "Hey, someone should eat that." Sam took it as a challenge and said, "You know what? I'll eat the slug." And so he picked that slug up, threw it in his mouth, and he ate it. The next morning when Sam got up, he noticed a dull ache in his legs. So they went to the doctor and Sam brought up the fact that he had eaten this slug, and it looks like Sam had something called rat lungworm disease. This is an infection most commonly found in rats that's caused by a parasitic worm that can be passed down to snails and slugs if they eat the rat feces that contains the parasite's larva. Based on Sam's symptoms, the doctor informed him that most likely the slug he consumed at that party was a carrier of the parasite. Just a few days after his diagnosis, Sam did develop the rare form of meningitis, and he slipped into a coma for 420 days. When he finally woke up, he was paralyzed, he wasn't able to speak, and he couldn't eat without a feeding tube. He required care 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. These particular officers that would be doing this push-off had been undercover for some time in the area, and so they had a local drug house they used for these types of operations. 2 potential customers came up to the fake drug house, they knocked on the door, and the undercover police officers opened up, they invited them inside, and then once these customers were inside sitting down, they asked the undercover cops if they could buy some drugs. And as soon as the cops heard this, they whipped out their badges, they drew their guns, and they ordered them on the ground. But these potential customers, they didn't get on the ground. Instead, they whipped out their badges and drew their guns, and they said, "No, you get on the ground." Because it would turn out these customers were actually undercover police officers too, but they were from a different precinct, and so neither groups had any idea about the other. They all just eventually lowered their guns and then proceeded to beat the living crap out of each other. After the dust finally settled and all the haymakers had stopped, the 2 groups of police realized their mistake and apologized to each other. He caved and said yes, he would tell them the full story of what happened to Samantha, but they had to get him an Americano coffee, a peanut butter Snickers, and a cigar. Once he had said items, he began to speak. And what he said was so disturbing and so graphic, the FBI still has not released the full transcript of his confession. It would turn out Samantha was not Israel Keys' first victim. He was in fact a serial killer who specifically preyed on completely random people because he enjoyed watching them die. Next day, Luana was found dead in her apartment. When the authorities arrived at her house and began looking at the scene, it did not look like she had died as a result of those injuries. It looked more like some sort of ritual suicide. She was laying on this sofa with her arms over her chest. Next to the sofa was an altar that was adorned with strange occult symbols and ritual herbs and effigies. And on the altar was this goblet with deep, dark red stains on the inside. When they looked at Loana, even though she was fully dressed, underneath her sleeves were all these cuts on her arms, and there were cuts on her legs as well. After her autopsy, the medical examiner said she had died from a combination of blood loss and internal shock from ingesting massive quantities of blood that triggered cardiac arrest. Loana had been draining her own blood into the sacramental goblet, drinking it, and then doing it over and over again until she died. So the theory goes, Earhart and Noonan are making their way to Howland Island. They get off track somehow, and they wind up crash landing 350 miles away on Niku Maroro Island on one of the reefs. Noonan probably dies on impact, and Earhart, who's badly wounded and probably bleeding, she gets onto the island and she makes her way up to that area where that campfire was found. And for some amount of time, Earhart is able to survive off of whatever she had on her in those glass bottles, but in her weakened state and bleeding, at some point she probably attracted the coconut crabs who one night came out and swarmed her, ripped her to pieces, and ate her. In the 1930s, notorious dictator Joseph Stalin began deporting people that he viewed as threats to the regime. The worst fate of anybody deported to Siberia has to be the roughly 7,000 people that were sent to Nazino Island off the western side of Siberia. As the survivors disembark onto this snowy island, they see immediately that there's nothing on it. It's this tiny little island. There's no shelter. There's no food. There's no tools. There's no way to make shelter. They're just totally stranded. Their Soviet guards had promised them a ration of flour, but for the first 4 days, they refused to give it to them, and another 295 people died. And so by the time the guards actually took their boats into shore to give the flour to these people, they were starving to death, and they rushed the boats to try to steal the flour, and the guards began shooting at them, took the flour, and went back out to the water. Almost immediately, cannibalism became a thing, and there were these roving gangs of people who would just go around and murder the weak and eat them. So Skylar, she stands up and she turns. Her back is to her two friends. And as soon as she starts walking, what she would have heard is the sound of her two friends standing up as well, and then loudly saying, 1, 2, 3. And on 3, Skylar would have felt 2 knives being plunged into her back by Rachel and by Sheila. Sheila tackles her from behind. She gets her on the ground. She pins her on her back. Between Rachel and Sheila, they managed to hold Skylar's hands down, at which point Sheila and Rachel began taking turns stabbing her in the chest and in the neck. And at some point, she just kind of gives up and she says, "Why are you doing this to me? Why are you doing this to me?" And eventually, Rachel stops stabbing Skylar, but Sheila doesn't. Sheila keeps on going until, quote, her neck stopped making gurgling sounds. He normally would just eat the apples that were right outside of his house, but he had always been tantalized by the sugar apple trees that were inside of the fenced-off section of Komodo Island. This section was, of course, teeming with Komodo dragons, and so as a result, the locals basically fenced it off. But Mohammed had always wanted those sugar apples. He'd grown up here. He never got to have one. And so this day, for whatever reason, he decided, today's the day I'm going to get one. And so after looking around and feeling like the coast was clear, he hopped the fence and he ran out to the sugar apple tree. He's reaching out and extending his arm just far enough. He wants to get one more apple, and he loses his footing and he falls to the ground. And then she hears the sound of 2 Komodo dragons running through the tall grass. She can see the grass moving as these 2 massive creatures are running and grunting at full speed towards Mohammed. Mohammed, when he fell, he had cut himself, and they smelled his blood and they charged over. The authorities were able to get out there pretty quickly, and they were able to get the Komodo dragons off before they actually consumed him, but he was already dead. A billionaire by the name of Robert Bigelow, who had invested millions of dollars in National Institute for Discovery Science, specifically to research what he described as high strangeness, which really is just paranormal. So he purchases the ranch, and so they move into Skinwalker Ranch, and these 2 researchers are up on this ridge, kind of obscured and hidden, and they see this orange orb take shape, and you can clearly make out that it's this oval-shaped opening. They see this black human-like creature crawling out of this orange portal onto the ground, and then it starts running up the hill towards them. And they can hear the shale under its feet as it runs up, and it goes right past them. About 30 feet away from them, they're looking at it, and it just barrels past them at a full sprint up into the mountainside. There's been numerous books put together by some of the people that were a part of this NIDS research team, and to this day they believe that what they saw was a result of some paranormal activity. And what she saw was absolutely horrifying. That popping sound she heard outside of the plane was the sound of the engine underneath the left wing exploding. When that window broke open, Jennifer, who was sitting closest to it, was immediately sucked through the window. So no one is looking around, taking stock of what's going on and assessing what to do next. Everybody's in survival mode and is basically just focused on themselves. And so despite Holly yelling out and trying to wave to people, it was worthless. Jennifer was just stuck out the window and no help was coming. And it was during this time, as Holly is holding on to her waist and she's holding on to the girl, that Holly is thinking, Jennifer, she's been stuck outside the plane where there's no oxygen for almost 10 minutes. Nobody can survive that. But there's a detail in Holly's story that makes her experience even more traumatic. Because, if Harry Houdini can't perform this stunt, then certainly no one else can either. But in 1990, a daring 32-year-old man named Joe Burris decided he would be the person who would finally conquer this infamous stunt. And so with all these TV cameras rolling, the assistants walk up to Joe and they begin shackling his wrists, and they put these chains around his body, and then they lifted him up and put him inside of the see-through plastic coffin. And then this coffin was lowered into the 7-foot pre-dug hole that was right nearby. Once Joe gave the signal that he was ready to go, they would fill this hole in, and the stunt that he would perform would be to escape being buried alive. As they're watching this hole and as they're filming this hole, all of the cement in the hole suddenly drops about a foot. 10 days later, Dylan's body was found in an area nobody was searching. In fact, he was found by accident. He was located outside of town, high up a hill in a dense forest, which in order to get there, he would have had to walk the opposite direction of the gas station. But the case gets even stranger, because on the day Dylan went missing, there was a lot of snow on the ground, which meant people would have made tracks. But where Dylan was found, there were no tracks anywhere near him. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. It was as if someone had dropped him out of the sky. Another strange element of this case is Dylan was found without pants and without boots on. This led investigators to believe Dylan must have somehow made his way to that spot on the hillside in that forest without leaving any tracks. And then once he was there, he removed his pants and his boots. Except dozens of police officers and sniffer dogs were never able to find those pants and boots, despite the fact they should, in theory, be in that immediate area where he took them off. As a result, we may never know the truth about what happened to Dylan. On March 30th, 2020, a father of 3 uploaded a 38-minute long video to his brand new YouTube page. The video was titled, "What I Saw in My Room Still Haunts Me," and it was about his own firsthand experience of seeing this thing wandering around his cabin up in New Hampshire. The video had no special effects, it had no edits, there was really no context in the description. It was just this guy sitting in this strange yellow room telling this story. But within hours of posting it, it went massively viral. Not because it was some great work of art, but because it was too scary. People literally couldn't finish it. Since then, this guy has gone on to upload hundreds more videos to his YouTube channel about other people's strange, dark, and mysterious true tales, and just last year, his YouTube channel amassed nearly 1 billion views. Next Monday, February 14th, this storyteller, who just goes by Mr. Ballin, is finally going to do what the internet has been clamoring for since his first viral video, and that is to put out a podcast. And I know about this podcast now because I am Mr. Ballin, and I hope you will tune in to my new show next week, just called Mr. Ballin Podcast, and that you will subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. When I was 16 years old, I was an avid snowboarder. Me, Nick, and Wolf would go up to Nick's family's cabin. Unexpectedly, Nick's father passed away. So we make the trip up to New Hampshire. So that night, as I'm laying in bed, I'm thinking about how dark and quiet it is. I hear footsteps on the wraparound porch. And then the door opens, and this shadow figure walks into the room. But its hips are so high, I instantly was frozen with terror. And begins to walk down right next to me. And it does another quick movement, but it's facing away from me now. And it bows onto and then down through Nick's bed and disappears. Finally, I hear Nick's mom out in the living room making coffee. And the only thing I could think to do was to just ask, did either of your two sons, Nick's older two brothers, did they stop by? She's like, no. And she just goes, I heard my husband here last night too. We get back from snowboarding, and I'm laying in bed, and I'm constantly looking over at the digital clock when I heard those footsteps on the wraparound porch again. I cannot move. I'm drenched in sweat. Just from the few seconds that it's taken this thing to go from the door to the front of my bedroom. The door opens, it walks into the room, goes right past the foot of my bed, and I'm, again, petrified. Walks down the aisle between me and Nick. So it turns away from me and does the same thing it did the night before, folds onto Nick and disappears into the ground. When I heard Nick's mom out in the other room, it was like such a relief. And so I hear her and I go right out to the living room and I tell her everything. At the end of it, or towards the end, she just kind of stops me and she's like, John, I told you yesterday, and again, I heard it last night. That's just my husband. I heard him last night too. You got nothing to worry about. And I was like, no. I felt so helpless. That night I'm laying there, and after all my attempts to keep Nick and Wolf awake, they fall asleep. I hear those footsteps on the wraparound porch. The door opens and I hear the sleigh bells. Everything was the same. It walked into the house, but instead of going down the hallway towards our room, it kept walking into the lofted area. Walks up the stairs, and that's where Nick's mom slept. She was upstairs. I was now coming up on 3 days without sleep, so at some point that night, I did fall asleep, probably just out of sheer exhaustion. Now probably like 5 in the morning, I wake up again and I can hear Nick's mom. It didn't sound like she was making coffee. It sounded like something was wrong. And she's standing over this coffee table at the foot of the stairs and she's crying. Come here. She points to the coffee table and she's down on her knees looking at the table. And now I can tell she's probably crying tears of joy because scratched into the coffee table were the words, I love you. I was like, I'm done.
I like Mr. Ballin.
Okay. What's that one?
He's like a YouTuber who does like stories on, people who have done crime.
Oh, we're doing that. No, we're here.
In 1994, Terry and Gwen Sherman purchased Skinwalker Ranch. Terry looks out at one of these tree lines and he notices this huge wolf. The wolf comes over to this calf and immediately has the whole head of the calf in its jaws, just trying to rip it out of the cage. Terry starts firing shots at the wolf. The wolf is just totally unaffected. They decided to go track this wolf, and Terry could easily make out these footprints, but just suddenly stopped. There's no blood trail, there's nothing. It just walked in and vanished. And one night he catches out of his periphery what looks like a kind of mass of something moving around in the trees near his property. He would describe the mass as looking almost like a stealth fighter jet, but really small, and he makes the tiniest of noises against the brush. The lights immediately turn off, and it angles itself so it's facing directly at Terry. And he's staring at it, and it just flies away. By the spring of 1995, things have gotten really, really bad. One night, he's sitting on his porch with his rifle. He notices out on the horizon, orangey orb. He describes it as a portal. In the middle of the orange orb is this blue sky. It's as if he's looking through a portal into another world. He can see that a black figure is crawling out of this portal into his property. Following this night with the orange portal, Terry started to notice blue orbs. So blue orb started showing up on their property, and his 3 dogs are sitting with him that see the orb, and they start growling and barking, and so he lets his dogs go, thinking that maybe they can scare this thing off. And the dogs take off running towards this blue orb. So the next day, when the dogs haven't returned, Terry and his son, they go out looking for the dogs in the forest, and they find 3 stacks of ashes in like little burned out circles, as if there had been a fire. And it turned out it was the ashes of his 3 dogs that had gone into the woods. Some hikers came out of the tree line into Johnson Meadows. They notice up ahead what looks like a tent and a campsite. The campsite was definitely abandoned, and it looked totally destroyed. And so later that day, some Madera County sheriffs made their way out to Johnson Meadows. They would search the campsite and they would find some ID cards, and the name on those ID cards was Sandra Hughes. When Sandra's family heard about the state of Sandra's campsite, they told the sheriffs that Sandra was incredibly environmentally conscious. She would never, ever leave her campsite looking that way on purpose. Something else had to have happened. Over the next 2 days, a massive search was launched to look for Sandra. No one had seen Sandra, and despite this massive search effort over these first 2 days, nothing new was discovered that could lead authorities to where she had gone. But then, 2 days into her disappearance, Sandra Hughes was spotted. Some hikers were cutting through the Johnson Meadows area, and they saw this woman who was just standing off to the side of the meadow. She was by herself. She had no gear with her. She was barefoot. She had a black shirt on. She had blue jeans on. She had a bruise on her face, and she was just kind of standing there as if she was waiting for something. She didn't wave them down. She didn't act distressed. She didn't look like she needed any help. They just kind of saw this person minding their own business, and they walked right on past her. It wasn't until those hikers got to the parking lot that they saw all these missing person flyers out for Sandra Hughes, and they would see the picture of Sandra and they would see her distinctive blue hair, that they would say, oh my goodness, the barefoot woman we just saw standing in the forest is Sandra Hughes. And so the hikers called the sheriff's office. They headed out to where they had claimed to have seen her, but there was no sign of her, and there was nothing left behind that would indicate where she might have gone. The following day, Sandra's vehicle was located. And the vehicle was actually at the bottom of a ravine. Authorities believed Sandra was driving the car on that road and then hit a tree, and then she rolled off the embankment down to the bottom of the ravine. Someone had pulled out all of the things inside of the car and kind of thrown them carelessly all over the forest floor. The Madera County sheriffs couldn't help but think that this was eerily similar to how her campsite looked. They thought, maybe Sandra got hurt and the injury has impaired her cognitive abilities, and so now, maybe she's lost in the woods and doesn't know what's going on. And so a decision was made to just leave her vehicle where it was. Authorities left a note in the window of her vehicle that said, hey Sandra, we're looking for you. Please call this number. If you see this, your family really misses you. The search for Sandra would continue over the next several days. Nothing new was discovered, but there was one more terrifying twist coming. A year later, Jake Gorba, his wife Victoria, and their 3 young children decide, let's just pull over and we'll have a quick lunch. They hear their 3-year-old son, named Caden, start talking. He was turned and looking out his open window into the forest, engaged in some sort of intense conversation. And so Victoria looks at her son and goes, who are you talking to? And he would say, there's a woman out there and she needs our help. They turn back to Caden and they say, honey, we don't see anyone out there. And he says, Mom, she's lying face down and she's dead. She had a black t-shirt on, blue jeans on, and blue hair. When the sheriffs met up with the Gorba family, they brought with them a lineup of several women. And Caden looks at these pictures and he picks out 3 pictures. All 3 are Sandra Hughes. The sheriffs would return to that section of Shut-Eye Peak, but like always, there was nothing. As of today, we still have no idea where Sandra is or what happened to her. Susan was fighting with her husband Mike, and Susan had finally gotten the courage up to tell Mike she wanted a divorce, and Mike did not want a divorce. She pulled into the driveway of her 1-story Cape Cod home. She went in the back door, and right away she saw a note that her husband had left. And the note just said, Sue, I've had trouble sleeping. I've gone to the beach. I'll see you in a couple of days. And she noticed the first floor bedroom was really dark. And as she's staring at the room, a man she didn't recognize walked out from behind the bedroom door and started walking towards her. He had yellow rubber gloves on and he was holding a hammer. For many people, the sight of a stranger inside of your home carrying a hammer would be enough to prompt you to turn around and run out of your house. but not Sue. She had been an emergency room nurse for the past 30 years. She and the other nurses she worked with trained regularly in self-defense because you just never knew what was going to happen in the ER. And so here Sue was staring down this intruder in her house with 30 years of preparation for this moment. Sue ran at this guy faster than he was coming at her, and it caught him off guard. And so she rams him into the wall. He hits her in the head once with the hammer, but it wasn't enough to subdue her or even knock her down. She barely felt it. And the man would say 2 words, and it was, "You're strong." And Susan, when she heard that, it was like an adrenaline rush. She knew this guy was not trying to rob her. He was just trying to kill her. And she managed to wrestle the hammer away from him while pinning him against the wall, and then smashed him in the head 3 times with this hammer before he managed to get it back. She reaches out and puts her arm over his throat and puts him in a wicked chokehold, one that he was not getting out of. And she proceeded to choke him to death. And her attacker turned out to be 59-year-old Ed Haffey. They discovered Ed's backpack inside of Susan's house, and in it was a notebook that contained instructions for what to do after he killed Susan. And one of those instructions was to call Mike. It turns out this Mike was Susan's husband. He had paid Ed $50,000 to kill his wife. Audrey was one of the best freedivers in the world, and this day she was trying to become the best freediver in the world by breaking the world record for the deepest depth achieved by a no-limits freediver, which was 170 meters. They released the sled, and she began rocketing down towards the bottom of the ocean. If all went to plan, she would be back on the surface in 3 minutes. Audrey's descent was going perfectly until she hit the 164-meter mark. Because of the bad weather on the surface and all the rough water, that new lightweight cable she had, it was too light, and so the waves caused it to sway, and down at 164 meters, that swaying caused kinks in the line itself. And so as the sled was coming down, it caught one of those kinks and stopped at the 164-meter mark. And so Audrey just had to sit there for 30 seconds until finally that kink straightened out. Now, that 30-second delay might not have mattered if everything else in the dive went perfectly, but unfortunately, it did not. Once Audrey had set the record by hitting 171 meters, her sled came to a stop. And now it was time for her to go back up to the surface. She reaches over and turns the valve that's supposed to inflate the balloon that's going to bring her back to the surface. But after she turns the switch, nothing happens. The balloon does not inflate. A standby diver noticed the sled was not moving up when it should have been, and so he rushed over and jammed one of his extra hoses with extra air up into the balloon and tried to inflate it himself. But there wasn't enough air coming out of this tank for it to fully inflate, and so the sled began to move painfully slowly up in the water column. On the surface, when the 3-minute mark came and went and Audrey did not surface, her husband immediately threw on scuba gear and leapt in to try to save her. And by the time he got down to her and brought her out of the water, she had been underwater without air for 8 minutes and 40 seconds. Audrey was ultimately rushed to a hospital where she was later pronounced dead. The cause of death was drowning. Robert suddenly felt motivated to go out into his backyard and finally do a huge cleanup. The very back of his property was totally overgrown with bushes and shrubs, and so he figured he would just go back there and hack a bunch of it down. And all day, his neighbors saw him slowly making progress as he kind of hacked his way towards the back of his property. And by the evening that night, it looked like he was almost done. 2 days later, Robert's friends were at their favorite restaurant in town waiting for Robert to show up for lunch. After waiting for almost an hour and a half, his friends grew concerned because Robert was not the type of guy to just blow off a lunch meeting and not tell anyone where he was. And so the friends decided they would just drive by Robert's property to make sure everything was okay. But when they pulled onto a street, they saw down the end of the road in front of Robert's house were fire trucks and police cars and tons of commotion. It would turn out nobody had seen or heard from Robert since 2 days earlier, and so finally Robert's own family had called the police to do a welfare check on Robert. And what they discovered was horrifying. A police officer had gone up to Robert's front door and knocked. There was no answer, the door was locked, so the officer went around to the back of the house and he looks towards the back of the property and he sees there's some yard working tools that are just laying on the ground, and next to it looks like there's some sort of divot in the ground. And as he got closer and closer to this divot, he saw there was a small hole in the center of this divot in the ground. And he looked into this little hole, and then all of a sudden the ground kind of collapsed into itself, revealing a 2-foot wide hole where the small hole had been. And so he He carefully moved forward, testing every step, and then finally he got right to the edge where he could shine his light all the way down, and there on the bottom was Robert's body. In parts of Hawaii, people are afraid of falling into lava tubes. Robert fell through what is called a skylight, which is a small hole at the top of one of these lava tubes. The grass and the brush have kind of grown over the hole, and so you wouldn't necessarily see it. It would look like solid ground, when in reality, it was a death trap. 6-year-old Haley Zega was on a hike with her grandparents. Haley spots a waterfall that's off the side of the path, and she wants to go to it. And it was something that the grandparents just did not feel comfortable letting their granddaughter do, and so they told Haley no. And as they're walking, Haley would just slow down more and more. She was intentionally trying to take as long as she could, but the grandparents made sure they kept her in their view. So they would walk a little ways and turn, and she'd be right there. And then at some point when they turned, she wasn't there. The grandparents just ran all up and down this trail screaming for Haley, and they never found her, and so they ran down and they called police. The largest search and rescue mission in the history of Arkansas was launched for Haley Zega. But after 2 days, despite this incredible search, really no progress had been made. The only thing that had been found was one of the dog teams had tracked her scent up to a nearby road where the dog stopped, meaning the scent is now gone. And unfortunately, what that told investigators is it looks like Haley got picked up by some motorist. There were 2 searchers well outside of the primary search area. They spotted her. Overall, she seemed okay. She said that she was walking behind her grandparents and that she looked down, and then when she looked up again, she didn't know where she was. It got dark and she slept on top of that bluff. And she said, "That's where Alicia told me to stay." And they were like, "Who's Alicia?" And she said, "Oh, she's my imaginary friend. I met her on the bluff." And Haley said, "Alicia led me down the bluffs, and she stood in front of me and made sure that I didn't fall forward. She has black hair, brown eyes, she's 4 years old." And then Haley began singing songs that she had learned from Alicia. There was another little girl who had gone missing in the exact same spot as Haley 23 years earlier. She was 4 years old, she had black hair, brown eyes, her name was Alana, and she had died on those bluffs. News outlets were saying this imaginary friend was actually Alana, and that she was Haley's guardian angel. Haley, who's now 25 years old, says, "I don't know who or what she was, but she saved my life."